What if design wasn't just about solving problems, but about transforming the world, one intentional choice at a time? I'm Andrew Soren, and today on Meaningful Work Matters, I'm joined by Lesley-Ann Noel, Dean of Design at OCAD University and author of the amazing book, Design Social Change. In this episode, Lesley-Ann shares how design can be a radical, joyful act of agency. We explore how knowing ourselves, really seeing and listening to others, and even embracing the virtue of anger can fuel social transformation. She introduces the abolitionist mindset, naming what must end entirely, and explains why joy is essential in the fight for a better world. Whether you're a designer or a changemaker of any kind, Lesley-Ann invites you to rethink your role in shaping the future. Join us for a powerful conversation about design, justice, and the everyday actions that can build a more meaningful world. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Lesley Noel, it is a pleasure to be able to have you on Meaningful Work Matters. Thank you so much for joining us today. We met a few months ago at a human-centered work conference in Toronto, and I saw you speak a little bit about social change and specifically how we design for social change. And all sorts of light bulbs went off in my head, and I thought, wow, you are somebody that I'm really excited to have a conversation with. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Andrew. I've actually been thinking about this for a few months. I think that conference we went to was really exciting. I know that you're in the field of positive psychology, and I'm interested in positive psychology and in change and making the world good, as well as making the world adequate and good for us. And so I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Why don't we start by you sharing a little bit about who you are? What would you like listeners to know about you?
I'm the Dean of Design at OCAD University, so that's actually what brought me to Canada. I had only been to Canada once before, and then randomly in 2023, someone on behalf of OCAD reached out and said, we think that we have a job that you might be interested in. And I came with my partner, with my son, and we all came for the interview, and we're like, this Toronto is kind of exciting.
Not so bad. It's not so bad,
It's not
Toronto.
so bad. And Toronto is like really amazing. So I just picked up my family and I moved here. So I was trained in industrial design a million years ago. Beyond that, I've practiced in many different fields of design, and then I have a broad design practice, maybe rather than a deep design practice. But I've also been in academia for a pretty long time. Personally, I'm a mother. I I don't like to exercise so much, but I like the outdoors. I have a perpetual or eternal sense of adventure,
Mhm.
and I'm always kind of trying to discover something new. So, like, part of this move to Toronto, I told my husband and my son, we get the chance or the opportunity to explore this new place like we're on vacation. Every moment is pleasurable, and every weekend is like we're finding out something new. And I live my life in a very pleasure-focused way.
Mm. One of the recent episodes that we've just had on this podcast is a researcher whose name is Shige Oishi, who studies a psychologically rich life. And he says that often we think about happiness in kind of two major ways, or we think about well-being in two major ways, either all about kind of pleasure and kind of momentary happiness, or all about deep meaning and purpose. And he says that there's a third way that we
Oh,
haven't spent as much time thinking about, which is this idea that life is an adventure. kind of compares it to dark chocolate, like eating dark chocolate, this richness that's it's not necessarily like pleasurable in the moment. It's not necessarily deeply meaningful, but it like fills us with possibility.
Yeah.
It sounds like you are a bit of a model of psychological richness.
I think I have lived my life in a series of adventures that have involved like moving to new places and meeting new people and, kind of really putting myself out there, being bolder than maybe I really am in my own personality. Like the way I live life is bolder than I am. I'm looking for, yes, bold experiences and bold adventures. And I've taken actually a lot of risk that have made me ended up, made me end up in lots of different places.
It's great. You can't have opportunity without taking some risk. It's maybe even a good way of starting to think about design. Let's have a conversation about design. My background's actually in the arts, specifically in theater, and the idea of design has always been something that has filled me with awe. Might be the best way of being able to describe it. The capacity that we have to be able to design all sorts of things in life. And when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I discovered the work of Bruce Mao, who is an
Oh,
incredible designer, the designer of kind of a designer of everything, a designer of
oh,
massive change, which is the way in which I got to know him and his work around how do we really design the whole entire world for change.
oh,
And his work has really inspired almost everything that I have done since in terms of our capacity to think much more broadly about our role of design. So you write very powerfully about the idea that the design can be a change maker. What does that mean?
being from a developing country and studying design in a developing country and seeing people use design in different ways, that really has kind of followed me throughout my career, right? And when I went back to Trinidad, I was kind of maybe tangentially in the world of international development or an export product development. And then again, I was thinking of design in a way that it was supporting livelihoods because I worked with craftspeople and thinking about them and production and all that. I started to question the world of development, left that world of international development with more questions maybe
More.
than answers,
That's right. That's right.
right? And then eventually that's how I got to doing a PhD. In the PhD, I really was trying to think about empowering education. Actually, my son also is part of this, because he was like around school age when I was doing the PhD. And I was like, okay, can we just use our design abilities to think of better worlds? Or, I really was more interested in agency. And that's really where my PhD started to focus. And then since the PhD, I have been doing that kind of work with other people where the empowering education that I was trying to create for a primary school level, I really have just taken that into all of the work that I do. And I guess that's how I'm promoting social change, where I'm trying to get people to see that we all make the world and we could be trying to think about what is a better world that we can be making. And then if we think about the agential nature of design, that we can be making these worlds that we want, and then we could create kind of the social change that we might want.
There's so many things about what you've just articulated that I think are so important, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have you on this podcast, because I think that people who do meaningful work are often seeking to make the world a better place. I mean that's often a driving force as to what I think people think their work as meaningful is all about. Maybe it's about making a thing a better thing. Maybe it's about making the world a better place. Maybe it's about serving others in a slightly better way. But this idea of how do we help something be its greatest potential, I think is a huge piece of what doing meaningful work, of even more broadly trying to enact any kind of eudaimonia in the world, is all about. And I think design is such an important vehicle to help us be able to get there, because it is about agency.
Yeah.
It's about a future. It's about being able to say, there's this wonderful distinction between, in positive psychology, the distinction between hope and optimism. And
Mm.
optimism is often described as, being able to look into the future and see good things happening. Like that's
Mhm.
kind of one way of thinking about dispositional optimism. But hope is about being able to look into that future and see good things happening and say that I have a role in being able to make it.
Ah,
And that
okay.
when we have that sense of agency coupled with optimism, then there's something that we can actually move towards. And I feel like design is a way that we can do that.
So designers are typically optimistic, right? But I think it's interesting what you said about that, that differentiation between the hope and the optimism. When I was working on that curriculum for the children, it really was that hope that I guess I was focusing on, but I
Mm,
didn't have that language that you're talking about, right? But I've shared this story a few times with people where I used to teach in Trinidad and at the university, and there weren't a lot of design jobs, but my design students would go off into, I mean, they might become bank clerks or they might, they'd end up with jobs anyway. And then one year, I remember some employer talking to me at our like final exhibition, and they were saying, "Well, actually, I want more people like this." Right. And I don't remember who the employer was, but like they had hired a design student, and I was maybe to do a really low level job. But so it wasn't a design job, but they kept saying that the design students think differently.
mm,
And it is that designers and design students tend to understand their agency, especially if you are from a developing country, or you kind of have to hustle and you make your life for yourself, right? And um, and another designer from a developing country might have a different version of this story, right? But the what that employer was telling me is that the designers or the design students or the graduates from the design program solved problems differently because they understood agency, right? And so with that curriculum, I was trying to think, well, okay, can we foster that agency like really young so that everybody understands that we play a role in making this world? It doesn't just happen, right? That we can change the course of things. And sometimes when I tell people this, I'm a little bit worried that I'm setting them up for a little bit of despair
mm,
because it can sometimes seem like we can't change things. But, I then continue because I think that there is big change and there's small change, and um, sometimes we're making small change in the way that people think, right? And sometimes it's big change because we're changing a policy or something like that, right? And then in the class that I used to teach, which actually became a lot of the foundation of, or some of the foundation, because a lot of the foundation of the book is actually from the PhD. But this class that I used to teach is part of the foundation of the book as well. And it is, in that class, I used to talk about, well, how do we make social change? What is social change? And social change happens when an entire society changes the way it addresses an issue. And if we think about it very simply like that, yes, some of us will make big social change. So somebody like Jaime Leana, who changes the bus system in
mhm,
Curitiba, could make that kind of huge change, but some of us might make smaller social change, like my student who said, you know what, this Thanksgiving, I'm going to explain to my grandparents why they have to understand pronouns.
mm,
And that really happened in a class, where I asked, I gave everybody that kind of challenge before Thanksgiving. I said, well, what's the social change you're going to make? What's the thing you're going to do? And that's what one of the students said, I'm actually just going to sit over Thanksgiving and talk with my grandparents about pronouns. I'm like, oh, and yes, they are making social change
Mhm,
because through that conversation, they are helping society change the way that they address an issue,
mhm.
right? And so if you think about it like that, yeah, I may have gone off topic, but yeah.
We're exactly on topic. We're exactly on topic. Um, I wanna jump into, kind of one of the, I think, the central ideas of your book, and your book is, by the way, called, Design Social Change. This is a book that is published as part of a set of books that the D School at Stanford University has published. The D School being like one of the fundamentally kind of central design schools in the world. And so I think it's a huge honor just to be able to have that book as part of that series. And I love the whole idea of designing for social change. And really encourage listeners to grab a copy. It's a beautifully designed book, not surprisingly, but it's also incredibly actionable, which is like you do everything that you articulate is important to do in the way that you actually go through this book, which is like an extraordinary feat of design in and of itself. I mean, I think that's why one of the reasons why I love it so much. A huge part of this book, and kind of the way that you start, is the centrality of critical reflection when we think about design, period, and when we think about this question of agency. Like, you have to know yourself before you can do something. Can you say a little bit more about what that means?
Yes, and I'm also gonna shout out some people. I need to acknowledge the process and the people that made the book happen. So all of the artwork is by Che Lovelace, was a fantastic artist from Trinidad. Um,
And it's beautiful.
I
Oh my gosh, this
Yeah,
art,
yes,
this
yes.
art.
I mean, and I was very happy to be able to approach Che and say, "Hey, can we use your artwork?" And then in the book itself, the process was really a lovely process because I worked with an editor who kept reinforcing the idea that people have to be able to read this. If you are an academic writer, you write in a certain way. And my editor, the Jen Brown, and I, we would go back and forth and edit the writing so it was accessible,
Mhm,
right? And for me, that was one of the most satisfying things about the book. That at the end of the day, I could have given it to my son, who was 15 at the time, or my mother, who'll be 80 this year, and they can read it. So it is really about people being able to understand the information. And then the challenge for me and all of us who did books in the series is that this is a series of guides. So it wasn't just enough to say, here's the information. The books are written to be actionable.
mhm,
And that was another nice challenge for me in this process.
mhm.
So I just wanted to shout out all that. It was just a very pleasurable process, and
No, it's and thank you for doing so, because I think that a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are people who see their jobs in the world as applying science in context.
yeah,
And
yes,
I
yes,
think that this is the fundamental challenge of trying to figure out how do I take academic work? How do I take research?
and
How do
make
I
it
take theory
available.
and make it
Yes,
accessible, and
yes,
do that with integrity, and do that with a sense of giving people agency as to what to do with it? It's incredibly hard. It's incredibly important. And I think it's one of the ways in which anybody listening to this podcast is probably a designer without even thinking about it.
yes. So let me get to your question about knowing yourself, right? So Paulo Freire talks about building a critical consciousness, or conscientização, right? Building a critical awareness of the world around us. And I start with knowing ourselves because I think that, now this is my designer mindset. I felt that I had been asked for, too many times to show up in a neutral way and not acknowledge who I really was, and what I really what were the things that were meaningful to me, or how I was making the choices that I was making, right? And I start with knowing ourselves, knowing yourself, because qualitative researchers learn about declaring their positionality and understand that their position in relation to the work that they're doing affects the way that they do the work. And so the thing is that we have to know who we are because we affect the way that we change the world, right? So we have to figure out like what are the things that are really important to us and see, okay, how do we bring that into the issues that we are focusing on? And then we have to know also like where might we have a bias and how is that bias going to affect the work that we do, right? And the thing is, the things that are important to us, when we lean into them, we could be also raising issues that are important to other people that really need to be dealt with, right?
Mhm.
And maybe they're ignored, but they have to be addressed, right? So I found that I became a better designer when I became more comfortable in kind of understanding who I was and what was important to me. And so things like, even with regard to the research that I've done, right? When I declared my positionality, I was able to see, oh, I'm a mother, and that's why I'm a mother, and my child is X age. I think he was 10 when I started doing this research. And that's why I'm asking the questions in a particular way. It's not
Mm.
that I have a neutral interest in this, right? Um, I had to see as well that, like, um, my father in particular grew up in further away from the capital, had a certain kind of trajectory to get to where he was in the world. And I was really then trying to see, okay, do other people have access to this? Or how do we create access? And that influenced how I chose the site that I wanted to do the field work that I was doing. So, there are all of these things that
Mhm.
sometimes inform the questions that we ask, or not sometimes, often inform the
Often,
questions.
right,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
research becomes me search. Yeah.
Yes, yes. But then we have to see it
Mhm.
so that we understand how we are playing a role in the design process.
Mhm.
Right. So, it's like knowing ourselves is the first part of knowing the world. And so we start with ourselves. Then, I have a section in the book about listening to and seeing others. So
Mhm.
again, we start with ourselves, and then we learn to listen to other people and see them and understand issues from different, diverse points of view. Um, if we understand that our points of view are not diverse, we figure out how are we going to get these other perspectives, right? But really, we have to learn to then kind of see this world around us,
Mhm.
because, and now I'll use another Freirean quote, but I don't know which book it's from, right? But we cannot change the world if we cannot see the world, and
Mm.
so we have to spend a lot of time seeing the world and understanding what works and doesn't work. Being able to clearly see, okay, this doesn't work for people. This doesn't work for people like me. This doesn't work maybe for other people. Again, me being the super Freire quote person, right? Um, it's just that Paulo Freire is so good, right? But Frere also said something about the middle class and how, as people move into the middle class, they actually become blind to the injustices that were holding them back when they weren't in the middle class. And so it's
Mhm.
like we have to kind of open our eyes and see what these injustices were, and then figure out, okay, how are we going to kind of put an end to that kind of injustice?
This is, kind of very consistent within research about, like, generally grazing in power. too, right? And it's, I think, equally true about people who rise within an organization and take on
Yeah.
increasing leadership and executive power within, the things that you felt oppressed by, when you were lower, when you had less power, suddenly become things that you are potentially even in charge of oppressing others around,
Yes.
and that become suddenly invisible in increasing
Mhm.
levels of power. It's I want to go back to this kind of question of listening and seeing, and because these are fundamental design tools, and you talk a little bit about the limits of empathy and how we need to really push our capacity to see and to listen specifically. What does that mean? What does it mean for a designer to see and to listen?
Oh gosh, it just means getting closer, asking harder questions, understanding that people won't always give you the information in a way that you'll immediately understand it, right? Or, um,
Or that they'll
you
even
know,
immediately understand it, I would imagine.
yes, exactly. So they
Mm.
won't always understand it, but we have to be listening to lots of different cues, right? Like, I know in the book that there's an anecdote about somebody cooking food, and you know, and really, people do things like that all the time. Like they might not be able to tell us that they love us, but we could figure out through some of the things that they are doing or saying, or like another example that I sometimes think of when people are angry, or even when communities are angry, right? Not individual people. I've lived in places where communities go out and burn tires when they're angry. And one reaction might be, oh my gosh, why are those people doing those things, right? But the other thing is that we have to listen and figure out, okay, what is the thing that's driving this? So that we could respond to it. We could address the root cause
Mm.
of that, right? And then, like another listening kind of anecdote is that, now I'll get more designerly. When people give us feedback on stuff, sometimes you get hung up on the way people give us the feedback, but we're not really listening um, well if we are kind of more focused on things like the tone that they're using or the words that they're saying, or if we're going to really listen well, we're going to figure out, okay, what is the content that they're giving us that needs to be addressed. So listening to and seeing other people, of course it's a designly skill, because we cannot design well if we can't read those messages that people are giving us. So, um, we can't design well from our perspective, right? From our point of view, and we have to get as close as possible to the other point of view. Now, the thing about you just touched on empathy, and the reality is that, yes, as designers, we know that there are limits to empathy. We cannot just also sit in our position and design for other people, because we cannot. Um, there's a limit to what we can really understand that other people are going through. So again, we have to figure out how we're going to get even closer to people to understand that perspective. It could be that very often it is that we have to be working side by side with
Mm.
people to get there, right?
Mhm.
So yeah.
I want to get let's get we'll get into the co-design stuff in a moment, because I think it's another like wonderful way of kind of bridging gaps. I think it's a huge thing that we've talked about in other contexts within this podcast, about the importance of giving people voice and choice in almost anything, if you want to increase their capacity for a sense of meaning at work, and that often means kind of helping people be co-designers in projects. But before we get there, I want to actually touch on something else that you just talked about a moment ago, which is anger, and the power of anger to actually be virtuous. I mean, Aristotle talked about how anger can be a central virtue for us. It's not. We often think about anger potentially being a bad thing, but it can actually be a
Mhm.
fuel for something. And so I'm curious a little bit more about where you see the virtue in anger, and possibly that will bring us into what an abolitionist mindset is.
Yeah, so I wrote that before I became an administrator, which is kind of funny because, no, but even with my administrator hat on, I think that the anger is important from 2 points of view, right? The person who is angry has to use their anger as fuel.
Mm,
And and I know this is in the book, so you've heard this anecdote already, but there was a point where I was really, well, I've been angry so many times in my life, right? But I often kind of just talk about my anger and find somebody who I vent with, and I'm like, I was angry about blah 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 blah, and but there was a point where I had a mentor who sat with me and he says, I know that you're angry, and what are you gonna do now?
mm,
And, he was kind of talking with me and he's like, okay, so you're angry about X. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. They don't want to listen to my point of view. And then he says, and so what? Then the thing is, I'm not going to be included, blah, blah, blah. He says, but what is it that you really are trying to say
mm,
that isn't being included? And I'm like, yeah. And I kept bringing it back to my hurts. And he just kept pushing me harder and harder. And he says, well, you need to write about what happens because your point of view is excluded. Or, he said, so what your team may not want to include your perspective, but you need to be clearer about what the consequences of this not perspective not being included,
mm,
right?
mm,
And then so he really was telling me, take, and he may have actually said this, take that anger and use it to do something else,
mhm,
right? And so with that kind of guidance, actually, I've done a lot of angry work that has been very successful, right? It's maybe it's kind of akin to like I've heard musicians say that they write the best music when they're heartbroken,
mhm,
right? It's like we
mhm,
we might do the best design when we're angry, right?
mhm,
So it's like we have to use that anger in that way.
mhm,
But on the other side, like the administrator side, the side of the people who are not angry, not the administrators are not
maybe
angry.
angry in different ways.
Yes, yes. The people who are watching the angry people, we have to also use that anger, their anger as a fuel for what we do.
Mm,
So it's that it's fueling the both sides. That
mhm,
the anger on the other side tells us, "Oh, here is something that we have to pay attention to. We have to respond to this. We have to," so anger is giving us a cue that some attention is needed here, right?
mhm,
So it is a frightening emotion,
mhm,
and we're all like trained to be these good people and don't get angry and lower your voice and yeah, all of that. But I've learned of its importance in the work that I do now, right?
mhm,
I need to see where change is needed, and I am sometimes not able to see that through my lens, and other people's emotions help me to see that better.
mm. There's this really interesting thing that I have discovered diving more deeply into the meaningful work literature, and basically the reality seems that the more meaningful the work, often the worse the working conditions are, the less decency
Oh.
there is. Think about people who are um, international aid workers as an
Mhm,
example, or nonprofits. There's a recent study in Canada that just came out about the fact that, I think close to 50% of the nonprofit workers who were just surveyed in this kind of Changemaker Wellbeing Survey um, do not have a living wage sufficient enough to prevent food insecurity. Like
mhm,
massive challenge for people who are trying to do really good work in the world, are
mhm,
often in working conditions that genuinely suck. As I was reading the book, what I like, you pose this really powerful question around, sometimes do we need to take an abolitionist mindset to certain things, and so I'm kind of curious for your advice. Like, if well-being at work is really important, and
mhm.
structurally, people who do that work, whether they're nurses or educators or international aid workers or nonprofit, are in systematic structural conditions where that work isn't valued. What would it mean to take an abolitionist mindset to that kind of challenge?
So I think now I have to think, okay, which hat am I gonna put on? The administrator hat or the individual change maker
Yeah.
hat? So the abolitionist mindset is tied to understanding what just has to stop, right? What just has to end.
Mm.
What cannot be changed incrementally? Where is the radical change needed? And that could be both from um, the change maker who's the employee,
Hmm.
or the change maker who is the leader,
Yeah.
right? That abolitionist mindset means that we are identifying some things that are just not. Um, I thought of a French word, supportable. Or well, actually, I don't know if I said it in French or Portuguese, but the things that we just cannot support
Yeah.
anymore,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes we have to be looking like that and saying, this is not acceptable. Sometimes it's that it was never acceptable. Sometimes it's that it's no longer acceptable. But we do have to go through and identify those things. And, y- you know, at OCAD, I've seen a few people across OCAD who I would say have abolitionist mindsets. Not everybody, but there's one person who I'm thinking about in particular. I'm not going to say their role, right? But they go through certain policies and then they come back and say, okay, we just have to stop this
Mm.
because XYZ. um we have to stop this because this is not fair, or this is the and so it's like we need that kind of abolitionist mindset to just go in and say, this is no longer, maybe this was a policy, but this is not acceptable anymore, and we're just changing this, right? um I'll give like one little example, and then if they're listening, they'll know it's them, right? They just came one day and said, people who have changed their gender identity, or changed their names, have the right to have the name that they want on their degree.
Hmm.
So here is a policy. We are changing this.
Great.
And it's like, oh, that's that's an abolitionist mindset, because everyone will be like, "Ah, this is not even a problem. Why we
Yeah. Not a
yeah,
problem to them. But yeah,
exactly,
absolutely. Exactly.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, I encourage people all the time. I've been kind of focused on disruption, right? And I know sometimes I can maybe seem too disruptive, but I do encourage people to really look and see, where do we need big change, and then figure out what are we going to do to get there,
Mm.
right? Because there are the world maybe was built for a certain group of people and suited them well, but there are some big changes needed for it to suit more people well. And then what we think needs to change will change. And that's something that we have to keep in mind, that the goalposts will keep shifting because the things that we see as injustice today, or what we see as justice today, will change
Mm.
in the future. It's like as we conquer one set of injustices, maybe then we'll start to see other sets that we have to address, and other sets and other sets. And so like seeing oppression, seeing injustice, I think of it like a muscle.
Mhm.
And then as it gets stronger, we'll start to see injustice in other places that maybe we didn't see before. And then we'll work to address that.
I have one last question in this space, which is, where does joy fit into that?
Oh gosh. Joy is very important, right? Because it takes a lot of work to change the world, and it can drain you. I'm not advocating for people to be martyrs and, kind of um, live a life of suffering as they change the world, right? So, I mean, balance it. There are joyful moments with people, with communities, with joyful moments from seeing the change that has happened. So, I talk about anger and joy always in the same sentence, right? Where I we need that joy to continue the movements that we're in, right? If you think about like well, no, this is maybe not such a relevant example, but I see the black people. I see black people in the states with the fans right now, and it's not so relevant. But the thing is that we cannot always be angry. We cannot always be struggling. We do have to balance it and create these joyous moments with other people. And that will give us, again, the fuel and the energy to continue working and continue fighting and, move our movements forward.
Mm. Talking about joy, this conversation has been a genuine joy. I feel like we could continue talking for another hour, but maybe we'll pause here and maybe just have to return for more. There's all sorts of questions I have for you about design process, about co-creation, about all sorts of other things. But so we'll have to have a part two of this episode. But Lesley, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today.
Thank you, Andrew. This was joyous, joyful, and I look forward to connecting again and talking more and experiencing joy together.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.